I remember when, we were trying for, when I was married and we were trying for our son, we went to the doctor and, got a checkup and everything. And I just remember him saying, and I don't remember what the statistic was, but just how difficult it actually is to get pregnant and then take that baby to term with a live birth. I was shocked for a human being.
Absolutely. It's interesting because a lot of people don't actually realize that, the thing about it is this: in the general population, the great majority of people conceive without trying. Okay. So that's why we have this conversation of, quote unquote, overpopulation and, all sorts of discussions around that topic, because we think that, okay, well, everybody's getting pregnant, like it's the old story of like, oops, I'm pregnant accidentally. And, the reality is that, I don't even know how humans continue to exist and continue to reproduce, because in any given cycle, a woman has a 20% chance of getting pregnant and taking home a baby in basically, in peak fertility. So imagine, as it's not very much, and that is in her early 20s, right?
And she's healthy, and there's no problems, right? In a perfect world.
Absolutely. Wow. So we're talking peak fertility, 20% chance. As we become older, and as time progresses, that percentage decreases over time. But also, there are obstacles that might come into the equation that decrease those odds to begin with. So, for example, a woman might be diagnosed with irregular cycles for whatever reason, or a man might have lower than the average amount of sperm, or the sperm is not as good quality as it could be, or you name it. There are many different types of situations that could occur that come to the fore when a couple's trying and has been trying for a while, and they don't really understand what's going on. The chance of conception, and by the way, at peak fertility, at that 20% chance, the majority of couples will conceive within 3 attempts. That's 3 months. Okay. So it's pretty good odds, really, However, as we add one of those situations that I was talking about, all of a sudden we go from an average of 20% and 3 months time to pregnancy to an average of 2 years time to pregnancy. So it's a dramatic increase in the amount of time to pregnancy. A second minor factor, or a second obstacle, takes us to an average of 7 years, and a third takes us to an average of 40 years. Now, nobody has 40 years to get pregnant. Right. And this is based on epidemiological research, population studies around the globe. So, it's large data. The interesting thing about it is that and if we just did some rough calculations and we're very conservative on numbers, we've got a situation where, say, almost 8 billion people around the world, if we remove all of the elderly, if we remove all of the children, if we leave people who, kind of are in relationships, or just of the reproductive age, say between 45 and 42, 43, we are left with approximately, and again, being conservative, so the numbers aren't exactly correct, but about 100 million people who experience some kind of reproductive difficulty. So you can imagine, there are pros and cons to this kind of statistic, right? When it comes to public health, and that's my background, I've got a master's of public health from Harvard, and I'm doing a doctorate of public health there. And, public health's mandate is really, how do we support and do the best that we can for the largest number of people, but doing the absolute minimum that we can. So basically, how can we do the least for the most number of people? It is really kind of, because you can imagine when we're dealing with 8 billion people around the globe, we're really having to look at resources and figure out, okay, where are resources best utilized? In terms of public health. So those resources, and if you have a look at, different organizations around the world, those resources don't go to patients who are experiencing infertility because the majority of the population conceives without trying. Okay? So we then end up with this situation where couples who are struggling become underserved on their journey. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And when they are not underserved, what happens is that they are guided towards, strategies, treatments, and so
Mm-hmm.
on that are self-sustaining. Okay. So that basically can pay for themselves or make a profit.
Yeah.
So that's typically how the healthcare system is oriented.
Yes.
Okay, that's typically how it's structured.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if they're going to conceive, they're going to conceive, and let's just be as hands off as we can. And if they're not going to conceive, then, well, we might give some assistance, but otherwise let them just pay for whatever assistance they want
Mm-hmm.
and or need. And good luck with that. It's kind of like really what happens. And,
Yep.
it's what happens around healthcare systems around the globe. We treat patients in every continent other than Antarctica at this point.
Right.
And I see that kind of similar narrative in most healthcare systems. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some healthcare systems that are slightly different because they have different, kind of objectives. But for the majority, really, it's looking at how can we do the absolute least for the most number of people. Right. Now,
right.
When it comes to the types of patients that we're discussing right now, which
Mm-hmm.
typically there are many, many layers to,
Yeah.
why they are struggling to begin with. It's not as straightforward as going, oh, okay, here we go. We have no ovaries, or we have no testicles, or we have an absolute genetic mutation that
Right.
precludes this person from being able to reproduce. Really, only 5% of the global population has a genetic problem that will stop them from reproducing. So
It's actually kind of encouraging.
Well, but precisely. So typically it's not that, typically that's not the reason as to why people don't actually conceive and take, healthy pregnancies to term.
Right.
There's multiple other factors. And as we saw, if we add just these minor factors,
Mm-hmm.
these little obstacles, that the impact of them can be so powerful
Mm-hmm.
and extremely substantial.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point that, it can make the difference between having a baby and not. Okay.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so that's why, from the perspective of how do we address these situations, we really do need to take a step back and go, okay, if we were to look at self-care, if we were to look at what are some of the other factors that we need to take into consideration, what could they be? And there are many of them. And, despite the fact that, when a couple typically goes to a doctor to ask those questions, what else can I do? They're usually faced with, look, there's nothing you can do. You just need to go to IVF, or you just need to go and do this other thing. And that's where, there are lots of challenges in different paradigms,
right?
Because that's not necessarily the case. That's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily true. The impact of even our thoughts on our biochemistry and our body, how our body
Yes.
responds to things can be enough to change the way in which that communication between the different places within the body, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the ovarian axis, for example,
Mm-hmm.
can become completely shut down in trauma, right? And so
Yes.
what happens is that it's not simply a matter of going and doing fertility treatment, because in many cases where those concerns or issues aren't addressed and uncovered,
Mm-hmm.
they continue to perpetuate the result that a couple may not
Right.
want, which might
Right.
be infertility or miscarriage.
Right.